Hi everybody, so we're going to wrap up World War II today. We're going to take a look at how the fighting ended in World War II, especially in the Pacific region, and then we're going to look at kind of how the world tried to rebuild following World War II. So our objectives and standards to explain the final stages of the fight in the Pacific and analyze the decision to drop the atomic bombs. And please take a moment there to read over the standards. And our desired result is, how did World War II come to an end? So, Allied offensive. So in August of 1942, the Allies are going to attack Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This picture here is an American or Allied patrol in Guadalcanal on the Solomon Islands in September, so about a month later. So this is going to be the first offensive by the Allies in the Pacific. So it's the first type of troop landing of the Allies in the Pacific. And it will be the first loss for the Japanese on land. And again, like we mentioned in yesterday's lesson, that the Allies will continue to what they call island hop towards Japan into 1944. The defense of the Japanese are going to use a new tactic, come up with a new tactic that they had been kind of using. They're going to begin to use kamikazes, which are suicide planes that would crash into Allied ships. Now, this is a successful strategy that could sink and damage ships. For example, in the Battle of Liet Gulf, there were 424 kamikazes, but the Japanese, despite this new tactic or tactic they were using, still lost the battle. So the Battle of Iwo Jima. Allied forces were able to recapture the Philippines. Remember, they had lost them early in 1941, or later in 1941, I should say, and freed the prisoners of war. They then turned their attention to the island of Iwo Jima, which they believed they could use as a base to launch attacks against Japan from. Now, Iwo Jima was heavily defended by the Japanese, and the Battle of Iwo Jima will result in a large loss of life on both sides, but eventually the Allies will be successful at capturing it. I have two pictures here. On the right-hand side, you'll see this is an actual photograph of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. You may recognize this from, movies or whatever else you may have seen or heard about. But this is the flag raising on Mount Suwamachi on Iwo Jima. A very famous photo of Americans raising the flag after they had captured this area. And the photograph is actually used in the U.S. Marine Memorial, as you see here in Washington, D.C., outside Washington, D.C. It's actually kind of the basis for the memorial. So you can go see that in real life today, the actual and this is the U.S. Marine Memorial in Washington, D.C., based off of the flag raising on Iwo Jima. Okinawa. In April 1945, Allied forces are going to attack the island of Okinawa. This is the final obstacle to reaching the island of Japan. Again, there were devastating kamikaze attacks on ships and fierce fighting on the island. Again, large loss of life on both sides, especially the Allied forces too, but they were eventually able to capture the island. Now, another thing that kind of comes out of the battle for Okinawa is the Allies wonder if they could capture the main island of Japan without losing a massive amount of troops and supplies. So this is going to come into factor of whether it's a good idea or not if we should land American forces on the island of Japan. That how would the loss of life be? So it's a difficult decision. So the Allies were ready for an invasion of the island of Japan, but they also knew that an invasion of Japan would be deadly and costly. Actually, the Japanese were actually using citizens themselves to attack American soldiers as well. Elderly women would, have grenades and, blow themselves up and take, one or two Allied soldiers with them. Japanese troops were hiding in caves and attacking Americans from caves. So again, this plays into a lot of effect about how dedicated and sincere these Japanese troops and soldiers were, and citizens for that matter, were about fighting this war. So all those different things in play, President Truman, remember President Roosevelt passed away shortly before this, sees only one option to end the war in the Pacific. The atomic bomb. So Robert Oppenheimer and other scientists had been developing an atomic bomb for the Manhattan Project, like we talked about during the war. And when it was tested, it actually produced devastating results. So Truman needs to decide if the bomb should be used to end the war. He does decide it is the best option to save American lives and American resources. So President Truman will order the military to prepare to drop 2 bombs on Japan. In July of 1945, the United States is going to warn Japan to surrender or face destruction. When Japan refused, Truman approved the dropping of the bombs. So Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, which was a big American bomber, dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima in Japan. They chose Hiroshima because it was an important military center. Less than a minute later, every building collapsed in Hiroshima and the damage was widespread. The Japanese government still refused to surrender even at the large loss of life and resources. So 3 days later in Nagasaki, another atomic bomb was dropped. It leveled half of the city. Following the second dropping of the atomic bomb, Emperor Hirohito decides that the country and the people have now suffered enough. And finally, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan will surrender and the fighting for World War II will come to an end. And this will be VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day. Here's some pictures of the results of the dropping of the atomic bomb. The top picture here is results of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And then the bottom picture here will be, you can see this is an example of the picture of the results of the bombing of Nagasaki. Now you do have an assignment coming up that whether or not the U.S. should have dropped the atomic bomb. It's been debated between historians and Americans since we dropped the bomb on Japan. So you'll be doing an assignment tomorrow where you can kind of compare both sides and think if it was necessary or not. So Yalta. So in February 1945, going back a little bit, before even the surrender of Germany and anything like that, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in the Soviet Union to discuss the end of the war. Here's Joseph Stalin here. President Roosevelt looking very sickly. People realize now that he doesn't look very well. He looks kind of ill, and unfortunately, President Roosevelt will die a couple of months later. And then Winston Churchill over here. They met to discuss the end of the war. Stalin wants harsher punishments on Germany. Obviously, he's still angry at Hitler for invading the Soviet Union. He also wants to divide Germany into occupation zones that would be controlled by the Allied forces. Now, Churchill disagrees with this idea. He really doesn't trust the Soviets, and we'll talk more about that during the Cold War. But Roosevelt supports the plan, and his main reasoning for doing this is hoping that the Soviets would agree to the idea of the United Nations. So Germany will be kind of set up to be divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Americans, the Soviets, the British, and the French. This map here shows you how Germany will be divided. Green is the French, blue the British, red the Soviets, and then yellow the U.S. Now, over here you'll see Berlin, and Berlin we're going to talk about much more later on in the Cold War, but Berlin will also be divided into different sectors as well. Russians, the U.S., the British, and the French. We'll talk about that white line there, the Berlin Wall, later on. Stalin is also going to promise free elections in Soviet-controlled countries. Not going to happen, but he makes that promise as of right now. Churchill and Roosevelt believed that Germany would be united in the future. Again, Soviets really don't have any intention of that, but for the time being, that's the plan. And Stalin also agrees that he will join the war in the Pacific as well. So what happens in Germany? Well, the Allies were determined to punish those who were responsible for war crimes and the Holocaust. They put 24 surviving members of the Nazi Party on trial. It included party officials, military leaders, and other citizens or businessmen who had supported the mass execution of the Jewish or others in some type of way. Now, 12 of these men will be found guilty and sentenced to death, while most of the rest of these men, the other rest of the 24, will spend the rest of their lives in prison, or a good amount of time in prison, I guess you should say. So what about Japan? The U.S. forces are going to occupy Japan after the war. Many Japanese officials, including Prime Minister Tojo, were arrested and put on trial. 7 of them will be sentenced to death, including Tojo. He will be executed for his war crimes. And Japan will eventually, excuse me, begin to transform into a free market economy that will be establish a new democratic government. All right, so kind of think about, what factors led to the end of World War II, what were kind of the decisions made to, in Germany and Japan with regards to the end of World War II, and I'll hopefully talk to you guys later on.